The city of Leicester hums with the mundane rhythm of modern life. Cars come and go, following the stark white lines painted on a sea of asphalt. It's a place of errands and appointments, utterly ordinary in every way. Yet, for centuries, this very spot held a secret that defied imagination. Just a few feet beneath the tarmac and the tired gravel, lost to time and the trampling of progress, lay the answer to a mystery over 5 centuries old. This wasn't a missing object or a forgotten relic. This was a missing king. An entire dynasty, the very last of the Plantagenet line, and the brutal, contested truth of his final moments were hidden in the earth, waiting. The story of this king is one of the most dramatic in history. A tale of ambition, betrayal, and a bloody death on the battlefield that ended his reign and birthed a legend of a monstrous, child-murdering usurper. His name was dragged through the mud of history by the very dynasty that defeated him. His memory shaped by playwrights who painted him as a villainous hunchback. After his death in 1485, he was given a hasty, unceremonious burial, and as the years turned into centuries, the location of his grave vanished from public knowledge, becoming one of history's great unsolved puzzles. All that changed because of a determined few who refused to let the legend be the final word. They followed a trail of cryptic clues from ancient texts, a belief that defied conventional wisdom, and a seemingly absurd hypothesis that pointed directly to this unassuming parking lot. This is the incredible story of how a hunch, a line in a centuries-old poem, and a team of dedicated archaeologists pulled a monarch from the shadows, finding the lost grave of King Richard III in the most improbable of places. The name Richard III conjures an image that has been frozen in the amber of historical infamy. For over 5 centuries, he has served as England's archetypal villain king, a figure whose reputation is synonymous with treachery, murder, and a ruthless lust for power. This is the Richard immortalized by William Shakespeare, the scheming hunchback who clawed his way to the throne over the bodies of his own family, a man so consumed by ambition that he would not hesitate to order the deaths of his 2 young nephews, the princes in the Tower, to secure his bloody grip on the crown. This theatrical portrait of a physically and morally deformed monster has proven so compelling, so dramatically potent, that it has largely supplanted the complex historical reality in the public imagination. He is the usurper, the last Plantagenet king whose brief 2-year reign from 1483 to 1485 ended in cataclysm on the battlefield at Bosworth, paving the way for the Tudor dynasty. Yet, it is crucial to understand that the Richard we know today is, in many ways, a fabrication, a character meticulously crafted by the very dynasty that overthrew him. History, as the old adage goes, is written by the victors, and in the case of the Tudors, the vilification of Richard was a political necessity. Henry Tudor, who became Henry VII, had a profoundly weak claim to the throne. His legitimacy rested entirely on his victory in battle and his subsequent marriage to Elizabeth of York, the sister of the missing princes. To justify his own rule, he and his successors, particularly his son Henry VIII, needed to paint the previous regime as so irredeemably evil that any alternative was preferable. Through proclamations, chronicles, and the works of sympathetic writers like Sir Thomas More, a systematic campaign was waged to blacken Richard's name. Every action of his reign was reinterpreted through the lens of tyranny, and the mysterious disappearance of the princes was laid squarely at his feet, a crime so heinous it served as the ultimate proof of his unfitness to rule. This Tudor-sponsored caricature was then gifted to the world by Shakespeare over 100 years later. Writing under the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, Henry VII's granddaughter, the playwright had every incentive to please his Tudor patrons. His tragedy, Richard III, is not a documentary but a masterpiece of political propaganda, cementing the image of the bottled spider and the poisonous bunchback toad in the cultural consciousness for all time. The real man, a complex feudal lord, a loyal brother and able administrator for much of his life, was erased, replaced by one of literature's greatest antagonists. This leaves us with a profound historical dilemma. How do we separate the man from the myth? For centuries, it seemed an impossible task, with the truth buried under the weight of narrative and the passage of time. But what if a key piece of evidence, long thought lost forever, could be brought to light? What if the king's own physical remains, his bones, could be found, offering a silent, unbiased testimony to his story, his suffering, and his death. This is the quest that would begin not in an archive, but under a modern-day parking lot, seeking to give a voice to a king silenced for over 4 centuries. The final chapter of Richard III's life, and the genesis of the 500-year mystery, began on August 22, 1485, at the Battle of Bosworth Field. It was here that the forces of the Yorkist king met the invading army of Henry Tudor, the last scion of the rival house of Lancaster. The battle was a chaotic and pivotal moment, marking the violent climax of the Wars of the Roses. Contemporary accounts, though filtered through Tudor-leaning sources, suggest that Richard fought with desperate courage. Seeing Henry Tudor vulnerable and isolated across the battlefield, Richard led a near-suicidal cavalry charge directly at his rival, a bold attempt to decide the fate of the kingdom in single combat. He reportedly cut down Henry's standard-bearer and came within feet of Tudor himself. However, the charge was not enough. The timely intervention of Sir William Stanley's forces, who turned against the king, sealed Richard's fate. Surrounded and overwhelmed, he was cut down in the marshland. His death was not that of a Shakespearean villain, cowering and shrieking for a horse, but of a medieval warrior king, the last English monarch to perish on the battlefield. His death instantaneously extinguished the Plantagenet line, a dynasty that had ruled for over 3 centuries, and crowned Henry Tudor as King Henry VII. The treatment of the fallen king's body was as significant as his death in battle, setting the stage for his eventual disappearance. After the fighting ceased, Richard's battered and stripped corpse was subjected to ritual humiliation. It was slung over a horse like common baggage and transported back to the nearby city of Leicester, a public display of the Tudor victory. There, to provide a semblance of Christian burial without creating a martyr's shrine for his remaining supporters, the body was interred within the Church of the Greyfriars, a Franciscan friary. The burial was, by all accounts, hasty and ignominious. While he was laid to rest in the choir, a place of honor within the church, the records suggest it was a simple affair, lacking the grand tomb one would expect for an anointed sovereign. For a few decades, his grave remained known, a quiet, unmarked end to a turbulent life. But this was only the first act of his disappearance, a temporary resting place before he would vanish entirely from sight and memory. The final, irrevocable erasure of Richard III's grave occurred half a century later, a direct result of the tectonic religious shifts of the English Reformation. In the 1530s, Henry VIII, desperate to break from the Pope and secure a male heir, initiated the dissolution of the monasteries. This was a systematic campaign to disband monastic communities, seize their vast wealth, and dismantle their physical structures. The Greyfriars Priory in Leicester was not spared. In 1538, it was forcibly closed, its income confiscated by the crown, and its buildings were systematically demolished. The stones were likely carted away for other local construction projects, and the land was sold into private hands. As the church itself was reduced to rubble and its precise layout faded from living memory, the location of Richard's grave was lost. The king, who had been buried without a prominent monument, now slept in an unmarked spot beneath what would become new buildings, gardens, and eventually urban development. In the absence of a known grave, folklore rushed in to fill the void. A persistent and poignant local legend emerged, claiming that during the dissolution, the king's bones had been disinterred and unceremoniously thrown into the nearby river Soar from a bridge, a final symbolic act of desecration ensuring he would never have a peaceful rest. This story, though later proven false, captured the profound sense of loss and disrespect that had come to surround the fate of the last Plantagenet king, cementing the belief that his physical remains were gone forever, scattered by the currents of both the river and time. For centuries, the fate of Richard III's body was a subject for academic debate and local folklore, a mystery considered intriguing but ultimately unsolvable. The story had hardened into legend, and the prevailing belief, fueled by the tale of his bones being cast into the river Soar, was that his remains were lost forever. However, this resigned acceptance was not universal. A dedicated group of historians and enthusiasts, united under the banner of the Richard III Society, had long championed a reassessment of the king's maligned reputation. For them, Richard was not Shakespeare's caricature but a complex figure of his time, a reforming king whose story had been twisted by his enemies. They worked tirelessly to re-examine the historical record, but the question of his physical resting place remained a frustrating, elusive grail. The catalyst for turning academic interest into a tangible archaeological quest was Philippa Langley, a screenwriter and a dedicated member of the society. Langley approached the mystery not just as a historical puzzle, but with a profound sense of personal conviction. While standing on the city streets of modern-day Leicester, she experienced a powerful and uncanny feeling that the king was close by, a sense of connection that transcended the centuries. This hunch became a driving obsession, compelling her to launch what would become known as the Looking for Richard Project. It was a mission born of both deep empathy and rigorous research. She, along with other society members and consulting historians, began to pore over medieval maps and historical documents, cross-referencing them with modern city plans. Their research consistently pointed to a specific area: the former site of the Greyfriars Priory Church, which historical records confirmed as his burial place. The trail was leading them to a clear and startling conclusion. Yet, this intellectual breakthrough presented a seemingly insurmountable practical problem. The historical maps, when overlaid onto the modern cityscape, revealed that the heart of the Greyfriars Priory, the most likely location for the choir where Richard was said to be buried, now lay directly beneath a city council parking lot. The contrast could not have been more absurd or disheartening. The search for an anointed king of England, the last of the Plantagenets, had led to a mundane tarmacked car park, filled with the everyday vehicles of council employees and visitors. The sheer improbability of the situation was a major obstacle. Convincing anyone to take the idea seriously, let alone fund a disruptive and expensive archaeological dig on a long shot, was a monumental task. The quest now hinged on transforming this eccentric theory into a viable scientific endeavor. The moment of decision arrived when dogged persistence began to yield results. Philippa Langley's unwavering belief proved infectious, and she managed to secure initial funding, much of it raised from private members of the society. She then faced the bureaucratic hurdle of securing permission from the Leicester City Council and the necessary archaeological permits. This required assembling a credible team, which she found in the University of Leicester Archaeological Services, ULAS, led by Richard Buckley. While initially skeptical of the odds, Buckley and his team recognized the rigorous historical groundwork that had been done and agreed that the location was, at the very least, a plausible candidate for Greyfriars. The stage was set for what was, in essence, a high-stakes gamble. With a painfully limited budget and just 2 weeks to dig a single, narrow trench, the Looking for Richard project was ready to break ground, hoping to find a king under the most unkingly of places. On August 25, 2012, beneath the relentless hum of Leicester traffic and the indifferent gaze of parked cars, the extraordinary search began. The University of Leicester Archaeological Services team, directed by Richard Buckley, started their work with a sober understanding of the odds. They had just 2 weeks and a budget that allowed for only a single narrow trench to be carved into the tarmac of the social services parking lot. It was a calculated gamble, a needle-in-a-haystack endeavor where the haystack was a city block of urban development and the needle was a long-lost king. The initial objective was not to find a skeleton, but to find the walls of the lost Greyfriars Church. Confirming the location of the priory itself was the critical first step. The atmosphere was one of focused, professional anticipation, tempered by the realistic possibility of finding nothing more than modern utility pipes and rubble. The very first day of digging, however, delivered a jolt of electrifying promise. As the excavators carefully peeled back the layers of modern soil and demolition debris, they almost immediately struck masonry. These were not random foundations, but the clear, sturdy walls of a religious structure. They had found the Greyfriars Priory, and with startling speed. The precision of the historical research had been vindicated, transforming the project from a speculative long shot into a serious archaeological investigation. The team now concentrated their efforts within the trench, meticulously working down through the centuries, searching for the church's choir, the area where, according to historical records, Richard III had been laid to rest. It was in this sacred space, the heart of the church, that the ordinary rhythm of the dig was shattered by a discovery that would change everything. A member of the team uncovered the first sign, a human leg bone emerging from the earth. With painstaking care, using trowels and brushes, the archaeologists began to expose the rest of the skeleton. The full picture that emerged from the Leicester clay was both poignant and startling. The individual had been buried in a crude, hastily dug grave, seemingly too short for the body, with the head propped awkwardly against a corner, a clear sign of a rushed and disrespectful interment, consistent with the account of a defeated enemy being buried without ceremony. But it was the condition of the spine that drew gasps. As the soil was cleared from the vertebrae, a pronounced S-shaped curvature was revealed, a clear case of severe scoliosis. This was no longer just any skeleton. This was an individual with a significant spinal condition, a physical attribute that aligned perfectly with historical descriptions of Richard III's appearance, though not with Shakespeare's mythical hunchback. The evidence was beginning to form a compelling, almost unbelievable chain. The tension and excitement built with each new observation. The skeletal analysis at the site began to compile a profile that matched the historical king with uncanny precision. Osteological examination confirmed the remains were of an adult male in his late 20s to early 30s. Richard was 32 when he died. Then came the evidence of a violent end. A closer inspection of the bones revealed multiple perimortem injuries, wounds inflicted at or around the time of death. Most dramatically, a massive cleaving injury to the base of the skull, consistent with a blade from a halberd, pointed to a catastrophic and fatal blow in battle. Here was a man who had died in extreme violence, buried without a coffin in the choir of Greyfriars Church. Every single piece of the puzzle, the location, the age, the sex, the spinal deformity, the battle trauma, and the ignominious nature of the burial, fit together to form an inescapable, breathtaking conclusion. They had not just found a skeleton. They had, against all conceivable odds, found their skeleton. The sheer improbability of the moment was perfectly captured by lead archaeologist Richard Buckley, who later recalled the surreal nature of the discovery, noting that the first thing they saw were the feet, still articulated in the ground, with no sign of a coffin. It was a bizarre and powerful detail that underscored just how extraordinary this find truly was. The king, lost for 527 years, had been found. The discovery of the skeleton was a monumental event, but for the team at the University of Leicester, the real work was just beginning. The compelling circumstantial evidence, the location, the wounds, the curved spine, was powerful, but it was not in itself conclusive proof. To move from a strong hypothesis to a verified historical fact, they needed to subject the remains to a battery of rigorous scientific tests. This was not a process of seeking to confirm a predetermined identity, but one of forensic elimination, where every piece of evidence had to withstand intense scrutiny. The world was watching, and the burden of proof was immense. They had to build a case so watertight that it would convince the most ardent skeptics and rewrite the history books beyond any reasonable doubt. The investigation proceeded on multiple fronts, each line of inquiry acting as an independent verifier. The first of these was radiocarbon dating. A small sample of bone was sent for accelerator mass spectrometry analysis to determine its approximate age. The results placed the individual's death in the late 15th or early 16th century, a range that perfectly encompassed the year 1485. This immediately ruled out the possibility that the skeleton was from a later period, firmly anchoring it in Richard III's time. Next, a team of forensic pathologists conducted a meticulous analysis of the skeletal injuries. They identified a total of 11 wounds, 9 to the skull and 2 to the rest of the body, all consistent with a sustained and violent assault in battle. The most dramatic was a massive cleaving injury to the back of the skull, likely caused by a halberd, which would have exposed the brain and been instantly fatal. Other wounds on the skull suggested a humiliation injury after death. This pattern of trauma was not just consistent with dying in combat. It was consistent with the specific accounts of Richard III's death at Bosworth, where he was surrounded by enemies and his body was mistreated after the fighting had ended. Simultaneously, osteologists conducted a detailed study of the skeleton's pronounced scoliosis. Using 3D modeling, They reconstructed the precise nature of the curvature, confirming it was a right-sided spiral deformation of the spine. This was a crucial piece of the puzzle. While it would have caused one shoulder to be higher than the other, it was not the congenital hunchback of Shakespearean legend. The individual would have had a distinctive appearance, but would have been fully capable of the martial prowess expected of a medieval king. This finding brilliantly reconciled the historical record with the physical evidence. Contemporary sources written before his rise to the throne described him as having one shoulder higher than the other, a description that matched the skeleton perfectly, while debunking the later, exaggerated Tudor propaganda. Yet, the most definitive proof, the scientific smoking gun, lay in the realm of genetics. The research team embarked on an unprecedented effort to extract DNA from the ancient bones. The goal was to find a living maternal line relative and compare mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, which is passed down virtually unchanged from mother to child. After a global genealogical search, they found two such descendants: Michael Ibsen, a Canadian-born carpenter living in London, and a second anonymous individual. When the DNA sequences were compared, the result was staggering. The mtDNA from the skeleton was a perfect match with both of Michael Ibsen, confirming an unbroken maternal lineage stretching back over 17 generations to Richard's sister, Anne of York. It was a genetic fingerprint that could not be refuted. When combined with the archaeological, osteological, and radiocarbon evidence, it formed an irrefutable chain of proof. The man in the car park was, without any doubt, King Richard III. The scientific confirmation in 2013 marked the end of the search, but it also marked the beginning of a new, deeply symbolic chapter. For over 500 years, Richard III had lain in an anonymous and ignominious grave. Now, a profound question of legacy and reconciliation had to be addressed. A legal ruling determined that his remains would be reinterred in Leicester Cathedral, a site a short distance from his original resting place but a world away in terms of dignity and honor. What followed was not merely a reburial, but a week-long series of events in March 2015 that served as a state funeral in all but name, a poignant and unprecedented moment of national introspection and closure. The process of returning the king to his rest was conducted with a solemnity that stood in stark contrast to his initial treatment. His bones were carefully placed inside a coffin hand crafted by a Canadian descendant, Michael Ibsen, using English oak from the Duchy of Cornwall. For 3 days, the coffin lay in repose at the University of Leicester, allowing the public to pay their respects. Then began a final, remarkable journey. The coffin was transported to Bosworth Field, the site of his death, for a memorial service, before being taken on a procession through the county of Leicestershire, retracing in reverence the path his body had traveled in disgrace in 1485. The culmination of this journey was his arrival in the city of Leicester, where tens of thousands of people lined the streets in a silent, respectful vigil. The sight of the simple oak coffin, borne on a horse-drawn gun carriage and followed by dignitaries and descendants, was a powerful and moving spectacle, a collective act of remembrance that transcended the controversies of his life. On March 26, 2015, a televised service at Leicester Cathedral, attended by senior clergy, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and members of the royal family including the Countess of Wessex, formally laid the king to rest. The service was a careful and ecumenical blend of modern commemoration and medieval tradition, acknowledging the complexity of his legacy while focusing on Christian themes of reconciliation and mercy. His coffin was then lowered into a brick-lined vault beneath the cathedral floor, directly below a plinth bearing a tomb of pale Swaledale fossil stone, intricately carved with a cross, and his name, dates, and royal insignia. The tomb itself, set within the calm space of the cathedral, is a permanent and dignified memorial, inviting quiet contemplation. This final resting place, chosen after consultation and some legal debate, stands as a lasting symbol of a wrong, in some small measure, being righted. The king who was lost, maligned, and forgotten had, through a twist of fate and the power of modern science, been returned to the public memory with honor, finally accorded the respectful burial he was denied for centuries.